Okay, so let's get started with today's session. Right. So before we get into this poll, I just want to show you guys. I want to kick this off by looking at two different boards and kind of just comparing the how the big blinds check calling threshold changes with the board. So both of these sims are for button open versus big blind call, and you can see button is c-betting a third of the pot on the flop. And what you'll notice, right, is that when you compare these two textures, right, Queen 10-5 two-tone as well as Queen 5-4 rainbow, you'll see quite a drastic difference in terms of the big blinds, in terms of where exactly the threshold for check calling is, right? So on Queen 5-4, we're floating really wide, right? Ace high, every single ace high is pretty much a pure call. And then you even have hands like King Jack and King 10 with just like a naked overcut. And even Jack 10 is floating at some frequency as well. So definitely a very loose defending range. Whereas on Queen 10-5, you kind of see the opposite, right? We're folding even like some of the pocket pairs at some frequency. And we pretty much only call the very best ace sides, right? So hands like ace-7, ace-8 with the ace of diamonds get the call. But, even like ace-8, 8 of diamonds is just a pure fold, right? So defending like a really tight range here. So let me put the question to you guys, right? Like, why do you think this is happening, right? So there are a few possible reasons, right? First of all, it could just be because the ace high has better equity when the board is dry. Right? It could also be because we're lacking flush draws and straight draws on Queen 5-4 rainbow. I mean, there are going to be a bunch of straight draws, but definitely not as much as on Queen 10-5, where big blind has all the offsuit combos of like King Jack and King 9 and Jack 9, right? And not to mention the flush draws as well, right? So could it be that it's because we're lacking better draws to defend with that we're forced to defend ace high? Or maybe both of these answers are true, right? So let me know what you guys think, right? Maybe Nick can just pull up the poll.
Poll is up now. We'll keep it open for 10 to 15 seconds and we'll look at the results.
Okay, so the most popular answer is C, all of the above. So it turns out that the correct answer is actually A. We're defending more ace high because ace high has better equity. So well done to everyone who got it correct. And the reason why B it's not a valid answer is because the flop is usually not a street where we're that concerned about how high up we are in our range, because we're not going to defend MDF anyway, right? And there's some flops where we overfold by a massive amount, and then there's some flops that we call around MDF. So generally speaking, it's not that important to know exactly where we are in our range, and our focus should actually be on how much equity our specific float has, right? So to prove this to you guys, right, we can do a really simple experiment, right? What I've done here is I have another sim where you can see the flop is also Queen 10-5, and the only change that I've made, right, is basically to remove all of the flush draws from the big blinds range. So if the second option is in fact true, and we are, defending, and we're more inclined to defend ace highs when we're lacking draws to defend with, right, then what we should see is the big blinds start to float more ace high because we have a lack of flush draws to defend with, right? But instead, we actually see that there's not that much of a difference when it comes to the check calling threshold. Right? If anything, we seem to be folding a little bit more. You can see a7 and a6, right? They're more or less pure folds now, right? Whereas previously we were calling those the combos with the ace of diamonds, right? So yeah, this kind of shows that it's not really that important to be thinking about things. It's not that important or accurate to be thinking about where you are in your range, right? And you're mostly just concerned with how much equity your exact hand has, right? Because the way that it actually works here is that when you call these kinds of floats, right, most of your EV really comes from the times where the flop checks through, because you have like one extra chance to see the river and potentially improve, right? And if your range is lacking all of these flush draws, right, it's going to become much weaker, specifically on flush completing runouts. So the amount of pressure that you're going to face, right, on the turn is actually much higher, because your opponent is going to be barreling into you at a much higher frequency on average. And what happens is it ends up hurting the EV of your floats, right? So it's kind of works the opposite way, right? If you take away the flush draws, you might think that we got to defend like ace highs because we don't have better hands to defend, right? But it actually hurts the EV of our ace highs such that we defend even tighter, right? So the main point here is that it's not only more accurate, but it's also simpler to just think in terms of how much equity your exact hand has, right? And when it comes to the equity of your floats, right, there's a couple of factors that affects it, right? First of all, how connected and how drawy the board is, right? So coming back to the same example, let me pull up the queen 10-5, queen 5 deuce board again. Right, so it's it's more accurate to think in terms of your opponent's range instead, right? So like here, we are defending more ace high, not because we lack better hands to defend with, right? But because our opponent has a lack of straight draws as well as flush draws, right? The board is pretty dry. There's no flush draws to worry about. So your ace high is going to be good a little bit more often, right? Especially even after you reach the river, it's going to hold up a bit more often because your opponent's floats have, or rather your opponent's bluffs have less equity against you, right? Whereas on queen 10-5, there's all these like flush draws and like Broadway draws that you have to worry about, right? Like previously on queen 5-4 rainbow, you're beating all of these king highs and jack highs that didn't have much equity against you, right? Now all of a sudden the king highs and jack highs, so many of them have a straight draw or flush draw to go with them, right? So it just makes us want to defend like that much tighter, right? And then the second factor that's a little bit less obvious has to do with the rank of the side cards, right? So going along with the same example, right? On the board like queen 10-5, right? What you'll notice, what you'll notice about the buttons range in general is that there's like a offsuit threshold somewhere around 8x, right? So there's a lot of 9x offsuit and above in the buttons range, right? And really not that much 7x offsuit and below. So on a board like this, right, where you have multiple cards 10 and above, right, button is going to hit quite a bit of one pair, right? And this amount of one pair is of course going to decrease the equity of our floats, right? It's going to make us defend much tighter. And the reason why we're focusing on the offsuit combos is just because there's like so much more of them compared to the suited combos, right? So queen 10-5, we defend quite tight. Queen 5 deuce on the other hand, right, where you have multiple cards 7 and below, right, and the button doesn't really connect with the 5 and the 4 that much, right? It's going to improve the equity of pretty much every single hand in our range, right? So that's why we call like almost all of our ace highs, and we float as wide as jack 10 as well. Okay, so to show you guys how important like this idea of being aware of where the aggressor's offsuit threshold is, right, I'm going to pull up a bunch of boards that look very similar. Right? So first of all, A7 deuce, as well as Ace 9 deuce. Right. So if you're looking at these boards for the first time, probably your defending strategy as the big blind, right, it's going to be pretty similar. Right. Yeah, I don't think most players are going to have like a huge variation in how much they're floating on either of these boards. Right. But based on what we just talked about, right, the button actually has a lot more 9x offsuit compared to 7x offsuit. Right. So what we actually end up seeing, right, is that the big blind's defending threshold on A7 deuce, right, is actually much lower. He gets to float much wider because big blind is not as worried about running into offsuit one pair, right? There's not much 7x in the buttons range, right? So let's just do a side-by-side comparison, right? You can see on A7 deuce, we're floating really wide, right? King, queen, king, jack, king 10, even king 9 is calling sometimes without the backdoor straight draw, right? Whereas on Ace 9 deuce, right, we're calling king queen, yes, but even king jack is just a 0 EV call, right? Same with the backdoor flush draw combos, right? We don't even call like all of the king high with backdoor on Ace 9 deuce, whereas on A7 deuce, right, with king high with backdoor is just too strong to fold, right? It's a pure call, and we even start to call some of the queen high of spades here, right? So that's how important it is, right, to always keep in mind like where exactly your opponent's offsuit threshold is. Right? And then another more extreme example would be, let's say if the board was 7-4 deuce, right? So, now there's not just two, but there's three cuts, 7x and below, right? So the button has almost no offsuit one pair to the board. And if your opponent happens to be betting a small size here, right, your defending range is going to be really wide, right? We're folding like almost around 80% of the time and calling all sorts of rubbish like, Jack 10, 10, 9 offsuit, right? Just because we're not so, because of the lack of offsuit one pair in our opponent's range, right? Which gives all of our floats much better equity. As for adjusting versus different bet sizes and positions, right? Of course, you want to tighten up versus bigger sizes, not just because you're getting worse pot odds, right? But also bigger sizes are going to be more polarized, right? There's going to be a lack of marginal hands, right? For example, if you face a small bet like 1/3 pot, right, it's going to be full of marginal hands. And what most of these marginal hands are going to do is check behind on the turn. So when you call the small bet on the flop, you're not only going to get to see a turn, very often you get to see a free river as well, right? So that allows basically your floats all get to realize equity a lot better. Whereas if you face a big bet, your opponent has less marginal hands, he's going to continue barreling the turn really often, right? And you actually want to tighten up by quite a bit, compared to the smaller size. Right? And secondly, as we go earlier in the positions, the threshold for calling also increases. So this is in line with how much equity our floats have, right? If our opponent's range is tighter, the same hand is just going to have less equity, right? Therefore, we end up folding hands that we would have otherwise called versus a wider range, right? But the same concepts are still going to apply, right? So for example, when you're looking at early position versus big blind, right? And if we compare these two boards, okay, so let me pull up some sims for early position versus big blind, right? Let's take a look at Queen Jack high rainbow board, right? And here we're facing a half pot bet on the flop, so slightly bigger size, right? But what we're going to do is compare it with Queen 9-4, right? So first of all, when we take a look at Queen Jack 4, right, big blind is playing pretty tight, right? Not just because of the larger bet size, but also because the in-position range is much stronger, right? So it's folding pretty much all the time, nines and below, right? Not really floating like any ace highs as well, right? And the main thing you want to pay attention to is the offsuit threshold in the low jacks range, right? There's a ton of Jack X offsuit, but really not that much 9x offsuit and below, which is why when we change the board to Queen 9-4, right, we see a really different strategy, right? Which is that now the pocket pairs are starting to call at a much higher frequency, and we even float hands like ace jack, ace 10 with the backdoor, pretty much all the time, right? Just because your opponent is going to hit much less offsuit one pair, right? Which gives all of your floats much better equity. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about playing versus double barrels, right? So this is where it becomes a little bit more important to be aware of where exactly you are in your range, right? So basically you got to keep the flop size as well as your opponent's position in mind, right? Because all those things are going to affect your flop threshold. Basically, the turn is a street where we start defending a little bit closer to MDF, right? The way I like to think about it is on the flop, we do a lot of overfolding because the ranges are often very asymmetrical, right? Button's range is much stronger than the big blind, right? So the big blind has to compensate for it by folding more hands, right? Even if it's overfolding, it's still fine, right? The objective is really to create an even playing field on the turn. Otherwise, if the big blind starts floating so many hands against a range that's stronger than yours to begin with, right? Then when we go to the turn, in position is just going to be allowed to barrel at a really high frequency, and then all of the worst floats in your range are going to they're going to start becoming really minus EV, right? So your objective on the flop is always to create this even playing field on the turn. And then once you get there, then we're kind of in a more familiar situation where it's like quite important to think about where we are in our range, because we got to defend at a certain frequency so that our opponent's bluffs don't become too profitable, right? That's not really a concern on the flop because his bluffs are going to be quite profitable regardless of what he does. Right? We're not really trying to make them indifferent or anything, right? But when you actually get to the turn, right? And the ranges are a little bit more balanced and a little bit more symmetrical. Yeah, maybe symmetrical is the wrong word, right? But you're not at, the point is you're not at that big of a disadvantage, right? Then now we want to defend a little bit closer to MDF, right? And that's when you got to bear in mind like what exactly the flop bet size was, right? For example, if you face like a small bet on the flop, like one third pot, right? And you face an over bet on the turn, it's quite rare that we fold hands like top pair, right? Top pair is probably just calling all the time since your flop calling range was quite wide, and you got to be like very aware of that as well, right? Whereas if you face a pot size bet on the flop and an over bet on the turn, then it's very normal to be folding hands like top pair. Right? Of course, it will depend on the exact texture of the board as well, right? But in general, we just play much tighter on the turn, right? If we're calling a tight range on the flop to begin with. Okay, and the second point is that equity is more important than absolute hand strength, right? And this gets more true as you start to face like bigger bet sizes, like versus a turn over bet. It's, you know, whether or not you have like middle pair or top pair weak kicker, right? It's gonna be a bluff catcher either way, right? So we usually pick hands that have more outs, right? So for example, middle pair with a straight draw, right, is gonna be continuing much more often than top pair with no redraw, right, against a very big bet. Okay, and one last point is to always try to think exploitatively, right? Basically, what we don't want to do is just look at what the solver is doing and just try to copy that, or look at how the solver is playing against a double barrel, right? Instead, okay, so let me pull up an ace king high board as an example, right? So let's say here we face a half pot bet on the flop, right? So we check call, and the turn is a blank, and let's say we face an over bet, right? So once again, what you don't want to do, right, is look at the imposition, is look at the big blind's response versus the over bet, right? And then just like play exactly according to this, right? It doesn't really make sense to do that because when you do this, you're kind of assuming that your opponent is playing perfectly, right? And very often he's not going to be playing perfectly. Like, look at this strategy, for example, right? It's so unrealistic to expect your opponent to be like over betting with hands like queens and jacks and tens on the turn, and they're not just over betting; they're almost over betting 100% of the time. Okay, so maybe let's talk a bit about why this is happening first, right? Like here, what's happening here is also related to the flop threshold, right? Because you know, first of all, the bet size is a little bit bigger, right? It's half pot instead of one third. And also your opponent's range is really strong, right? Early position versus big blind. And also because of the board texture, right? There's going to be like a lot of offsuit one pair in the low jacks range on this board, right? So when you put all those things together, right? The big blind is playing really tight on the flop. He's even folding hands like middle pair at some frequency, right? So when you actually get to the turn, right? A hand like queens or jacks actually doesn't have that much showdown value because it's not going to check it down against like any worse hand that often, right? Most of the flush draws in the big blinds range are probably just going to be bluffing the river, right? So queens and jacks, they don't really have much showdown value. And then on top of that, low jack is lacking natural bluffs here because if you look at hands like, if you look at the spade combos that he has, right, there's very little, we're not really raising like suited connectors and gappers from early position, right? And then most of the flush draws we have are just combo draws. And it obviously wouldn't do to only bet hands like value hands as well as combo draws, right? Like our betting range would be way too equity driven, right? And we don't even have like that many straight draws because we're not raising like queen 10 and jack 10 offsuit from early position. So yeah, low jack is kind of forced to turn these hands into a bluff, right? Just to make sure that big blind has like some incentive to pay off its value hands. Okay, so knowing that this is the GTO strategy, right? What we can actually do as the big blind, right? It's just fold 100% of our bluff catches, right? That are 0 EV. Because if I have like ace 10, is 0 EV in theory, right? Like for sure, it's going to be like incredibly minus EV in practice, right? Since we don't expect our opponent to be finding all of these bluffs, right? Or another way you can think about it is that, you know, if you were to fold like 100% of these ace X combos, right, like ace 10 and below, right, what can your opponent do to exploit you? right? So the answer is, of course, that he can start like over bluffing, right? Not just he can start bluffing a lot, right? But he has to bluff more than GTO, right? In order for him to take advantage of the fact that you are overfolding, right? Even if he bluffs at a GTO frequency, right? He's actually not exploiting you, right? Because these hands are indifferent versus a GTO strategy, right? So it's not really the only way for him to take advantage of this is for him to bluff more than GTO, and it's almost impossible. Like, how is he going to bluff more than GTO? Right, the solver's already bluffing with like queens and jacks and tens almost 100% of the time, right? So a nice exploit here is just to fold like all of your zero EV bluff catches against overbet, and it's actually quite a safe exploit in the sense that yeah, there's just nothing much your opponent can do about it, right? Even if you told him that you were overfolding, right, he might just be like misunderstanding the spot and not realizing that queens and jacks have to be turned into a bluff, right? So if that's the case, then it would actually become physically impossible for him to overbluff, right? Which is what makes it so safe to overfold in this spot. Okay, so yeah, just a quick poll, right? So on a board of queen five deuce seven, right? Let's say we check call a 1/3 pot bet on the flop. Which of the following hands is a pure call versus a half pot turn bet? Yeah, so again, I'll give you guys about 15 to 20 seconds, and I'm just going to check the chat in the meantime as well. Yep, seems like ace four is the most popular answer, and that is in fact correct, right? Like ace four, let me just pull up the sim. So queen five deuce seven. So let's say we face a half pot bet here, which does get used sometimes, by the way, right? Because we've seen that on this sort of texture, right, where there's multiple cards, 7 and below, right? Big blind tends to float quite wide on the flop, right? So this gives the button quite a bit of incentive to like build this small bet range around hands like 7x and pocket eights and pocket nines, right? Just to get a little bit of thin value, and also you get to deny quite a bit of equity. Okay, so against this small bet, what we see is ace four is a pure continue, right? Ace jack is mixing, and then fours is just a pure fold, right? So this really shows the importance of like having equity, right? And why equity is more important than absolute hand strength, because even though fours is a stronger hand than ace four and ace jack, right? But you only have 2 outs the times that you're behind, right? Whereas ace four has like an overcard and a gut shot against most of your opponent's betting range, right? And some of your outs are quite nutted as well, right? So there's probably like some implied odds as well. Yep, so well done to everyone who got it correct. Right, so understanding big blind threshold helps us exploit bettors in position too. So this is kind of the opposite example to the ace king highboard that we looked at earlier, right? If you're looking at big blind defense and you see that versus a half pot bet, big blind is supposed to call hands like ace 10, ace 9, and even some ace 8, right? Then what this means is that it's going to be a pretty good spot to bluff as the in position player, right? Of course, assuming that your opponent is finding all these floats on the flop, right? Yeah, it's quite difficult for him to like overcall. So even if you're bluffing like all of your air on the turn, for example, right, it's very unlikely for you to get counter exploited, right? Unless your opponent is like really sticky, right? But I imagine most regulars are not going to call hands like ace 9 on the turn, right? So you're not really going to get punished even if you bluff like 10-9 100% of the time on the turn. Okay, so now we come to playing the river after turn checks through. And once again, it's really important to keep in mind like the flop action, right? The flop bet size as well as the position, right? Because these things are going to affect how you play the river as well, right? Although that's it, the structure of your strategy is always going to be the same, right? Let's say this bar over here is your range, right? I've broken it down into 5 different parts, right? This is, I believe this is in mathematics of poker as well, but I've kind of recreated like my own version, but it should be the same thing, right? The idea is just that there's a mathematically optimal way to organize your range, right? If you ignore stuff like blockers, right, the shape of your strategy will always will always look like this, right? And each part of your range has a very specific function, right? If you're missing your value check raises, for example, right, it's going to be a disaster in the sense that the times that you check, your opponent can value bet as thin as he wants. He can value bet basically according to the strength of his hand, right? If he has like a strong hand, he's going to bet big. If he has a weak hand, like middle pair, he's just going to bet maybe like a third of the pot. Right? If he has ace high, he can bet 10% of the pot. And there's really nothing much that you can do about it, right? If you don't have any check raises, right? And then below that, you have your value bets, right? So of course, you're definitely going to need some hands that you bet for value. Otherwise, your opponent's going to realize like way too much equity. So that's kind of self-explanatory. And after that, you have your check calls, right? If you don't have a check calling range, your opponent's just going to get to bluff all of his air, right? And that can't be correct. And the opposite is true for your check folding range, right? If you don't have like any check folds, and this is actually a problem that I think happens sometimes, right? Some players, they just bluff like all of their air. So when they check, they're like always calling, for example, right? So if that's the case, then if you don't have a check folding range, your opponent is not going to have like any incentive to bluff you at all, right? Which obviously makes you really exploitable. And then finally, your bluff bets are there just to make sure that your value bets get paid off, right? If you don't have any bluffs, your opponent's not going to pay off your value. Same for bluff check raises as well, right? They're there to ensure that your value check raises get paid off, right? And in the event that they don't, at least your bluffs can take over the EV of your value hands. And as for where the bluff check raises, where you actually draw your bluff check raises from, it's you basically want to choose like any hand that is like close to 0 EV, right? Sometimes we even draw them from our check calling range, right? We really want to use hands that have like very good EV as a call, because for them to actually have the same EV as a check raise, right, you're going to need to get like an insane amount of folds, right? Which is probably not going to happen, right? I mean, if you have like good blockers and stuff, you will get like a little bit more folds, right? But if you have a hand that's really high EV as a check call, probably it's not going to get turned into a check raise bluff, right? So most of the bluffs will come from, it doesn't really matter where it comes from, to be honest, right? Like either even like your bluffing range, right? Some of the bluffs that you give up, they might get check raise sometimes, right? Your check folding range or your check calling range, as long as it's a hand that doesn't have that much EV, right? And the exact bluffs that you choose are really just completely dependent on blockers, right? So it's pretty complicated topic, right? Not really going to go into too much detail now, right? Instead, what I'm going to focus on is the bigger picture, right? In terms of how to recognize where all of these different thresholds are, right? Because the thing is, even if you can get like all of these blocker related stuff correct, but you like misunderstand the thresholds, right? There's going to be a much more costly mistake, right? Whereas if you know roughly where the thresholds are, even if you don't choose hands with like perfect blockers or the correct blockers, it's probably not going to be as costly, right? Than like bluffing a hand that you're not supposed to bluff, for example, right? That's when your EV loss really starts to become quite massive. Okay, so I'm gonna use this. I'm gonna open up this 10-6-3 board as an example. Right, so here again, we're facing this small bet on the flop, right? Not necessarily the best strategy, right? But it's just for discussion's sake, right? Just to illustrate like the certain concepts, right? So let's say we check call the flop and then the turn goes check, check, right? And the board blanks out, right? So here you can see the way that we organize our range, right? Is that there's very, very clear thresholds, right? So the very top of a range is going to check raise, right? Which is why you see like trips checking a lot, right? They're checking with the intention of check raising, right? And then after that, you have like your value bets, right? Hands like 10x, betting for a big size, right? And then hands like 7, 6x, 5s and 4s going for the smaller size. And then beneath that, you have your like check deciding range, right? So hands like 3x, right, would probably be mixing like check call and check fold the times that you check and face a bet, right? Same with hands like ace high as well, right? I mean, in this case, your opponent's going to be like relatively polarized when he bets, right? So it probably doesn't matter much whether you have like 3x or ace high. right? They're all just going to be like mixing calls at some frequency, right? But the important thing to pay attention to is really your threshold, right? If you know that false is the bottom of your value betting range, right? Then naturally you also know that 3x and probably ace high are going to be check decides as well. So you don't have to memorize like what every single hand in your range is doing. You just have to remember that, okay, this is where my value betting threshold is, right? And then similarly, this is where my bluffing threshold is, right? Somewhere around king 8 or king 9, right? King 8 is bluffing at some frequency. King 9 has enough showdown value, right? To just check it down. It's going to be worth about 1 big blind as a check, right? Which is not bad, right? So these are the two main thresholds that you'll need to keep in mind, right? And then once you have this, the rest of your strategy kind of falls into place, right? So once again, the worst hand that we're value betting is pocket fours, right? And then the best hand that we are bluffing is king 8. And you can see the thresholds are pretty low, right? Like king 8, king 9 isn't normally a hand that you would expect to have like a lot of EV when you check it down, right? But because of the nature of the situation, right? Going back to the flop, we're facing a very small bet, right? Which makes our check calling range much wider, right? We're facing a bet from button, which has a very wide range, right? So we're going to float even wider. And also the texture of the board, there's multiple cuts 7 and below. So we're not that worried about running into that much offsuit one bet, right? So the calling range is like pretty wide here, right? And in this line where the turn goes check, both players are going to have very wide ranges, right? So yeah, hand like king 9 is going to have a little bit more showdown value than what it looks like it does. Okay, so next I'm going to pull up another sim where we increase the flop bet size. Right, so we're going to look at the same board, but now in position is going to be using a pot size bet instead. Right, so let's take a look at the same line, right? Flop check call, turn check, and the board breaks out. Right, so what you'll see here is that because the flop size has increased, right, your flop threshold has gone up also, right? Your check calling range is obviously going to be much stronger, and your opponent's range is going to be much stronger as well, right? So previously, the worst hand that we were betting for value was pocket fours, right? But here, we actually need a hand like sevens, or I guess a6 is blocking sometimes. Bluffing threshold has gone up as well, right? You can see instead of like king 9, right now king 9, king 10 even is, or king 10 as a pair, sorry, king 9 is bluffing all the time. And the threshold has gone up to like king queen, king jack, right? These hands no longer have like that much showdown value that they just want to check it down all of the time, right? So instead of like fours and king 8, the thresholds are now a6 as well as and king queen, right? And this is just a result of facing a bigger flop bet. Yeah, and then like I said, once you have these thresholds and you have like a rough idea of where they are, everything else just kind of falls into place, right? Like here, if you know that king queen is bluffing at some frequency and king jack as well, right? Then every king high below that is just going to be bluffing all the time, right? And likewise, if you know that a6 is the worst hand that you get to value bet, right? Then the remainder of your 6x will just be check calling or check deciding. Okay, so one last poll to wrap things up. On the board of ace, king 8, 7 deuce. So flop was a pot size bet, then checks through. And note that this is early position versus big blind. Right? What do you guys think is the worst hand that big blind gets to bet for half pot on the river? Right? Is it ace 10, ace 5, or king queen? Okay, so this is pretty close. It's almost an even split. Correct answer is ace 10, right? So well done to everyone who got it correct. So I'm going to open up the sim. Basically, what I'm trying to illustrate here, right, is what happens when all of these three factors come together, right? Because so far we've talked about how our threshold depends on position, flop size, as well as pot texture, right? So in this case, it's early position versus big blind. We're facing a pot size bet, and the texture of the board, there's two cuts that hit our opponent really hard, right? Yes, offsuit ace x, offsuit king x. So all of these things make our threshold really high. So first of all, let's look at the flop check calling range, right? So now that we're facing a pot size bet, right, the calling range becomes like really, really tight. We're even folding hands like king 10 with a backdoor flush draw, right, which we would for sure never be folding for button versus big blind, for example, right? Or versus a smaller bet. So because of how tight our flop check calling range is, right? All of the thresholds that you see here, right? They get shifted upwards, right? And you really cannot be betting a hand as thin as king queen here. You know, if you have to bet king queen here for half pot, to be honest, it's going to be more of it's going to be an element of bluffing as well, because I'm pretty sure that in position is going to fold like some king queen. Right, so you're actually folding off a chop sometimes, right? It's definitely not. I guess there's some element of value as well, right? But it's really not strong enough to comfortably value bet, right? And it should belong in your check deciding range, right? And in fact, the worst hand that we get to value bet for this size is actually ace 10, right? So this is just a really extreme situation where all of these three factors line up to make the thresholds are really high. Same for the bluffing threshold as well, right? We're actually turning like almost all of our one pair into a bluff, right? 7x. Okay, of course, king x is strong enough to check, right? But hands like 7x, check 7 seems to be about the threshold, right? We're checking queen 7 but bluffing jack 7, right? So same reason, not just because it's just because your flop check calling range is like really strong. Okay, so bonus question is, how good of a spot do you guys think this is for the low jack to bluff catch, right? Looking at this strategy here, right? So, okay, I'll give you guys like a minute to think about it, right? And I will look at open up the chat in the meantime. Anyone has any ideas? Okay, Matthew says bad. Okay, Michael says very good spot. Pretty bad spot to bluff catch. Okay, so there seems to be like a good mix of different opinions, right? Omer says nobody bluffs with pairs, which is, yeah, probably true. Not always true, but I guess mostly true. Yeah, so a whole lot of different opinions, right? And there's a couple of guys saying that it's good to bluff catch because there's a lot of missed draws, right? But that's not such an accurate way of thinking about things, right? Because even if the big blind is bluffing like all of the missed flush draws and the missed straight draws, right? What you need to ask yourself is he really making a mistake by doing that? Right? Like, so what if he's bluffing all of the spades, right? Like, he is supposed to be doing that, right? It's not really a mistake for him to be bluffing, you know, queen jack and all of the missed flush draws all the time, right? The way that we define a mistake is a deviation from GTO. So if you find a spot where, let's say, the solver is not allowed to bluff all of its missed flush draws, right? Then you can say that that's a good spot to bluff catch, because probably what most players are doing is just bluffing all of their missed flush draws, right? So while it's true, like I definitely do agree that, you know, most guys are just going to like bluff with all of their missed draws here, right? But yeah, the point is that they're not really going to be making a mistake when they do that, right? In fact, is if you look at this strategy as a whole, it's very difficult for the big blind to be over bluffing, right? Like how would he over bluff here? It's almost physically impossible, right? He's already supposed to be bluffing all of his air, right? And you know, on the contrary, it's actually really easy for the big blind to be under bluffing, right? Because as long as he just gives up like a misdraw once in a while, right off the bat, he would be under bluffing. And also, it's really easy to make the mistake of value betting too thin as well, right? You know, judging from the poll results, you can see some people are value betting hands like king queen here, right? So that's going to make it even less attractive for you to bluff catch with a hand like king jack, for example, right? Because when your opponent value bets too thin, it's going to make their betting range much more skewed towards value, right? So yeah, turns out that this is like not such a great spot to be bluff catching, right? And on the contrary, right, if we go back to one of the previous examples that we looked at, right, where we have this this small bet on the flop on the board of 10-6-3, right? So again, all three factors are kind of lined up in the opposite direction, right? Big blind is calling really wide because of like various reasons, right? And then now that the board breaks out, right, this would be a really nice spot to bluff catch, right? Because the big blind is actually like very possible for him to be over bluffing here, because from what we know, right, the bluffing threshold is really low, right? That we're not supposed to bluff hands like king nine, right? But most of our opponents are not going to know that, right? Maybe they didn't watch this webinar, so they wouldn't know that king nine is supposed to be checking it down, right? So it's quite easy for them to be like having a couple, like too many bluffs, right? And at the same time, there's also like conceivable that they're not going to be value betting thin enough, because the value betting threshold is quite low as well. Like here we have a half pot bet, right? But if you allow like a third pot bet, probably 3x would start betting as well, right? So it's, as long as your opponent is, like checking hands like fours and fives, right? He's going to have like less value in the betting range, right? His range is going to be a bit more skewed towards bluffs, right? So for this reason, the combination of this board and the flop size as well as the wide ranges, right, make this a really good spot to be bluff catching.